The Cold War began before World War II had even ended. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were fighting on the same side against Nazi Germany, but behind closed doors they were already preparing for a confrontation with each other. They disagreed over Poland, they disagreed over Eastern Europe, they disagreed over Germany, and by the summer of 1945, the United States possessed a weapon capable of destroying an entire city. The wartime alliance was falling apart. But why? To understand the origins of the Cold War, we need to follow three meetings: Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were not natural friends. They were united by one thing: the need to defeat Nazi Germany. The United States and Britain feared communism. They distrusted Stalin's dictatorship and opposed the spread of Soviet influence. Stalin distrusted them for different reasons. He remembered that Western countries had supported anti-communist forces during the Russian Civil War. He believed the West had tried to isolate the Soviet Union during the 1920s. And during World War II, he believed Britain and the United States had waited too long to open a second front in Western Europe. The Soviet Union was doing most of the fighting against Germany. Millions of Soviet citizens had died. From Stalin's perspective, the Western Allies were allowing the Soviet Union to carry the heaviest burden of the war. So the alliance was never based on trust. It was based on necessity, and necessity would not last forever. The first major meeting was the Tehran Conference, held between November 28 and December 1st, 1943. The leaders were Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. Together they became known as the Big Three. At Tehran, they agreed to coordinate their military strategy against Germany and Japan. The United States and Britain promised to invade northern France by May of 1944. This would become known as the D-Day invasion. Stalin agreed to launch another major offensive on the Eastern Front. The leaders also discussed Poland. They agreed Poland's eastern border would move west. This allowed the Soviet Union to keep territory it had taken in 1939. This decision was important because Poland was not just a country on a map. It was a security issue for Stalin. Russia had been invaded through Eastern Europe before. Stalin wanted friendly governments between the Soviet Union and the West. Roosevelt and Churchill worried that this would allow Stalin to dominate Eastern Europe. The leaders also discussed creating a new international organization after the war. Roosevelt imagined a United Nations controlled by four major powers: the USA, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. At Tehran, the Allies were still cooperating, but the disagreements already visible. They were winning the war. They were not agreeing about peace. The next meeting took place at Yalta in February 1945. By now, Germany was clearly losing. The Soviet army was approaching Berlin. The Western Allies had invaded France and were pushing into Germany. The question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated. It was when it would happen. The question was also what Europe would look like afterwards. Stalin wanted a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. He wanted governments that would be friendly to Moscow. Churchill feared that communism was spreading across Europe. Roosevelt had a different priority. He wanted Soviet help against Japan. He also wanted Stalin to support the new United Nations. So Roosevelt was willing to compromise more than Churchill. At Yalta, the Allies agreed to divide Germany into occupied zones. The United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France would each control a part of the country. Berlin would also be divided, even though the city was located deep inside the Soviet occupation zone. The Allies also agreed to prosecute Nazi war criminals, but the most important premise concerned Eastern Europe. The Declaration on Liberated Europe promised that countries freed from Nazi control would be allowed to choose their own governments through democratic elections. On paper, this sounded like self-determination, but there was an obvious problem. The Soviet army had already occupied much of Eastern Europe. Stalin had the soldiers, the West had the promises. That difference would soon become critical. Only a few months after Yalta, the relationship changed dramatically. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt died. Harry Truman was now president. Truman was more openly suspicious of communism and less willing to compromise with Stalin. Then, during the Potsdam Conference, Britain held an election. Winston Churchill was replaced by Clement Attlee. The leaders had changed, but Stalin's position had also become stronger. The Red Army controlled large parts of Eastern Europe. In Poland, Soviet troops intimidated democratic opposition. Elections manipulated. Communist governments installed throughout Soviet-occupied countries. From the West's perspective, Stalin was breaking the promises made at Yalta. From Stalin's perspective, he was creating a defensive barrier against future invasion. Both sides believed they were acting for security, but the actions of one side looked aggressive to the other. This is how mistrust grows, not necessarily because one side believes it is all evil, but because each side interprets the other's fear as a threat. The final meeting was Potsdam, held between July 17 and August 2nd, 1945. Germany had surrendered, but the war against Japan was still continuing. The atmosphere was completely different from Tehran. At Potsdam, the wartime allies were visibly breaking apart. The allies agreed that Germany would be demilitarized, denazified, democratized, and decentralized. They also agreed to prosecute Nazi war criminals and divide Germany, Berlin, Austria, and Vienna into occupation zones. But the major disagreements remained. The Western Allies were angry that Stalin had recognized a Soviet-controlled government in Poland. They believed that he was building an empire in Eastern Europe. Stalin believed the West was trying to surround the Soviet Union with hostile capitalist countries. Then came the atom bomb. On July 16, the United States successfully tested the first atomic weapon at Los Alamos, New Mexico. Truman told Stalin that America possessed a powerful new weapon. He did not explain what it was. The bomb changed the balance of diplomacy. Truman became more confident. Churchill later wrote that Truman seemed like a different man after learning about the successful test. To Soviet leaders, the American atomic monopoly looked more like a threat than a weapon. It looked like a warning. The United States now had a weapon that could destroy a city. The Soviet Union knew it had to catch up. The nuclear arms race had begun. By the end of Potsdam, the alliance still existed officially, but the trust behind it, gone. The United States and the Soviet Union had different ideologies. They had different security concerns. They wanted different governments in Eastern Europe, and they were now competing for military superiority. The Cold War did not begin with one single event. It developed through a series of broken promises, competing fear, and opposing visions of the future. The Soviet Union wanted a buffer zone. The United States wanted open political system and limits on Soviet expansion. Each side believed that the other was trying to dominate Europe, and both sides began building alliances, armies, and weapons to prevent that from happening. The tragedy is both sides believed that they were acting defensively. But when two powers respond to each other's fear with more power, the result is escalation. The war against Germany had united them temporarily. The peace that followed divided them permanently. So were the United States and the Soviet Union ever genuine allies? Only in the narrower sense. They cooperated because they had a common enemy, but they never agreed about the world that should come after victory. Tehran showed the alliance working. Yalta revealed its contradictions. Potsdam exposed its collapse. World War II ended in 1945, but the struggle between capitalism and communism was only beginning. If you enjoyed this explanation, please watch more and subscribe for the next lesson. Like the video, share it, do all that stuff. Thank you for watching, and bye. Have a good day. And leave a comment about what you think happened, and if you like what you think.